The wind was cold that morning, and the army camp was already awake with noise and shouting and laughter. That was not kind but cruel and sharp, like knives cutting through silence. In the middle of the noise walked a thin girl with tired eyes and hands covered in dust. Her name was Lena, and she was the helper, the one who carried the buckets of water, cleaned the weapons, and washed the dirty uniforms that no one else wanted to touch. She walked quietly with her head down while the others laughed behind her back and called her names. They said she was weak. They said she was useless. They said she should have never come here, and every word hurt like a small wound in her heart. Still, she said nothing, because Lena had learned long ago that silence could protect her better than any sword. She just kept walking and working, never looking anyone in the eye. The camp was full of strong men and proud soldiers, and above them all stood Commander Rowan, a tall man with eyes as cold as the steel sword on his belt. He was respected and feared. His voice alone could make the ground shake when he shouted an order. But he never looked at Lena, not once. To him, she was just another nameless helper, a shadow that moved quietly and vanished when not needed that night. When the sun had gone down and the sky was dark with heavy clouds, a storm began to build on the horizon. The soldiers sat around fires laughing and boasting about battles they had never fought, and Lena worked near the tents trying to keep the firewood dry. She felt small and invisible, but deep inside her chest, something strong was sleeping, something she had buried for years, something she had sworn never to awaken. The laughter grew louder when a group of soldiers saw her stumble. They threw pebbles at her feet and called her clumsy. One even kicked over the bucket she carried, spilling water everywhere. She bent down to pick it up, her hands shaking, and one soldier whispered loudly enough for everyone to hear, saying she looked like a beggar who had lost her way. The others roared with laughter, and Lena bit her lip to stop her tears from falling. She wanted to scream. She wanted to tell them who she really was, but she could not because the truth could destroy her. So she stayed quiet, and when no one was watching, she touched her back lightly through her old shirt where a strange warmth always burned, where a mark she never showed to anyone lay hidden like a secret flame. The next day, Commander Rowan ordered a large training exercise in the open field. The soldiers cheered, ready to show off their skills. Lena was told to bring water and bandages as she moved between them. She watched their swords flash under the sunlight. She heard their boots thundering on the dry ground. And suddenly she noticed something wrong. A crate of gunpowder had been left near the fire pit. Too close, far too close, she tried to shout, but her voice was lost under the noise. She ran toward it, waving her hands, trying to warn them, and at that moment the fire sparked. The air exploded with light and sound. A wall of flame rose and soldiers screamed. Smoke filled the sky, and chaos swallowed the field. Lena fell hard to the ground, her ears ringing. She saw men lying motionless and others crawling in pain. She could have run. She could have hidden, but something inside her refused. She stood up, coughing and crying, and ran straight into the smoke. She dragged one wounded soldier by his arm, then another, pulling them away from the fire. Her skin burned and her eyes stung, but she did not stop. She moved faster than she ever had before. When the fire finally died down, the camp was silent again except for the crackle of embers and the sound of breathing. The soldiers stared at her in disbelief. The same girl they had mocked was now kneeling beside the injured, her hands trembling but her face calm. She pressed cloth against a wound and whispered words of comfort. As she leaned forward to lift a fallen soldier, the torn edge of her shirt slipped from her shoulder, revealing part of her back, and for a brief moment the flickering firelight touched a mark on her skin, dark and curved like a dragon's wing. One of the men gasped and pointed, but before anyone could speak, she pulled her shirt back up and turned away quickly, her heart beating like a drum. Commander Rowan arrived then, his face covered in soot, his eyes sharp as he looked over the wounded. When his gaze fell on Lena, he paused. There was something different in the air, something he could not name. He had seen her bravery. He had seen the strange symbol on her back, and for the first time he looked at her not as a servant, but as a mystery. That night, the camp was quiet again, the laughter was gone, and everyone whispered about the mark they had seen. No one knew what it meant. No one dared to ask. But deep inside, Lena knew that her secret had begun to awaken. The past she had tried to bury was now reaching for her, and nothing would ever be the same again. The moon rose high above the camp, shining softly on the torn tents and the resting soldiers, and in the shadows Lena sat alone, her back aching, her heart heavy and her mind full of fear and fire. She closed her eyes and whispered to herself that she would keep her promise. She would never reveal the truth, not even to the commander, no matter what came next. The camp was quiet the next morning. The smell of smoke still in the air, the sky gray and heavy with clouds that looked like they were carrying secrets. The soldiers whispered among themselves as they cleaned their weapons, glancing again and again toward the small tent where Lena sat alone. No one laughed now. No one dared to speak loudly, because something about that girl had changed. Something about her made them uneasy. The girl they once mocked had become the center of every whispered rumor. They talked about the strange mark on her back. Some said it was just a tattoo. Others said it looked like an old royal sign, a mark that only the ancient warriors carried. One soldier swore he had seen the same shape in an old book about the royal guards, a dragon's flame curved around a sacred sword. But no one knew how a poor helper like Lena could have something like that. It made no sense, and because people fear what they don't understand, they began to keep their distance. Lena sat quietly in her tent, her hands trembling as she washed the dirt from her arms, her mind heavy with memories she had tried to forget. She could still hear the sound of fire from the day before, could still feel the commander's eyes on her back when he saw the mark. And now she knew that hiding it any longer would be harder than ever. She closed her eyes and whispered a name that no one had heard in years, a name that once belonged to someone powerful, someone she had been forced to stop being. Outside, Commander Rowan stood near the tents, his sharp eyes scanning the camp as he spoke to his officers. But his mind was somewhere else. The image of the mark on Lena's back kept flashing before him. He had seen that design once, long ago, in a book locked inside the war archives. It was the same mark that belonged to the royal guardian family, the family that vanished after the rebellion 12 years ago. A family known for loyalty and strength, led by the great General Kale who had fallen protecting the King. Rowan had been a young officer then. He remembered the night the castle burned, the sound of battle echoing through the valley, and the story that one child from that family had disappeared, a little girl with a dragon-shaped mark. No one ever found her. Some said she died. Others said she escaped into the mountains. But if the rumors were true, if that girl had somehow survived, then she would be about the same age as Lena now. He decided he needed answers. That afternoon he called for her, his voice firm but calm as he ordered her to come to his tent. The soldiers around him stared as Lena walked across the camp, her steps small and uncertain, her heart racing. When she entered the commander's tent, she bowed her head and waited. The silence was thick like fog. Rowan studied her quietly, his hands behind his back. His expression unreadable, he said softly. "Yesterday you saved 2 men's lives." His voice deep and slow. "But I also saw something on your back, something I cannot forget." His eyes narrowed. "Where did you get that mark, Lena?" Her breath caught in her throat. She looked at the ground and tried to speak, but the words would not come. She whispered that it was only a tattoo, something from her childhood. But Rowan stepped closer, his tone sharper. "That is no common tattoo, that is a royal symbol. A crest known only to one family. Tell me the truth." Lena shook her head. Tears forming in her eyes, she said she did not know, that her mother had drawn it when she was small and that she never understood why. Rowan watched her carefully. He could tell she was hiding something, but there was fear in her eyes, not deceit, so he let her go, though his heart told him the truth was bigger than she could admit. When she left the tent, the soldiers outside stared again, whispering quietly. She could feel their eyes following her, could hear their voices calling her cursed and strange. She walked quickly back to her tent, her breath trembling. She wished she could disappear into the wind, but inside her chest the secret kept burning hotter, like fire trapped beneath her skin. That night she sat near the small river behind the camp, the moon reflecting in the water like a mirror. She dipped her fingers in and watched the ripples move across the surface. She remembered her mother's voice telling her to never show the mark, to hide it no matter what, because if the wrong people saw it, they would come for her and she would never be safe again. Far away on the hill, Commander Rowan stood watching the camp from his tower post. His thoughts heavy, he wondered what kind of life that girl had lived, to be so quiet and yet so brave, to carry a symbol of power and never speak of it. He knew that soon he would have to decide whether to protect her or expose her, because secrets like that did not stay hidden for long back in her tent. Lena could not sleep. Every sound outside made her jump. She felt like shadows were moving closer. The wind whispered through the fabric walls, carrying voices that sounded like the past calling her name. She closed her eyes and saw her father's face for the first time in years, his voice strong and kind, telling her to live, to survive, to keep the fire alive. She whispered a silent promise to him that she would stay hidden, even if it meant losing everything. The night grew colder. The stars faded behind the clouds, and in the darkness both Lena and the commander lay awake, thinking about the same mark, the same secret, not knowing that it would soon draw danger straight to their camp and change both their lives forever. The night had not yet ended when Commander Rowan opened his eyes. The candle in his tent had burned halfway down, and the silence was so heavy it felt alive. He could not sleep because the image of Lena's mark haunted him, the curved dragon flame that only existed in old history books. He reached for his old notebook, the one filled with records from the Great Rebellion, and turned the pages with shaking hands, each line of ink telling stories of betrayal, of heroes lost, and of a royal family that had vanished in one terrible night. He stopped when he saw the page he was searching for, the record of General Kale and his family, the most loyal guardians of the crown, warriors with the mark of the dragon carved into their skin from birth, the same mark now hidden on Lena's back. His eyes traced the words that said the general had died defending the king. His wife, too, had fallen, and their only child, a girl named Lyra, had disappeared. No one ever found her body, and the record ended there with a single note saying presumed dead. Rowan's breath grew heavy as he whispered the name again and again. Lyra, Lyra, could it be her? Outside, the first light of dawn was touching the camp. Soldiers were waking, the smoke from their fires rising like pale ghosts into the sky. Lena stepped out of her tent, her face pale, her eyes shadowed by sleeplessness. She felt the same fear she had felt for years, the same fear that had followed her from the village to the camp. She knew that her secret could not stay hidden much longer, and she could already feel eyes watching her from every side. She walked quietly to the stream to fetch water, her hands cold as she dipped the bucket. She looked at her reflection in the water and saw not the poor helper that everyone mocked before, but a stranger, a girl with the eyes of someone who had seen too much, the kind of eyes her mother once had. She remembered her mother's voice again, whispering to her before the soldiers came, telling her to run and never tell anyone her true name, to keep the mark covered and live as someone else, because the enemies of her father were still hunting for the blood of the royal guard. Lena closed her eyes and tears slipped down her cheeks. She whispered softly that she had kept the promise. She had hidden her name, she had buried her past, but the world around her was changing and she could not stop it now. Behind her, someone was watching quietly. Commander Rowan had followed her. He stepped forward and his boots crushed the leaves beneath his feet. She turned quickly and bowed her head, afraid to meet his gaze. He said gently that he had found something in the old records. He told her the name of the family who carried the mark, and she froze, her hands trembling. He asked her if she knew who General Kale was. She hesitated and then said in a voice so soft it almost vanished that he was her father. Rowan's eyes widened, the answer hit him like a storm. He whispered that it was impossible, that she should have been dead. But Lena shook her head slowly and said that she had survived because her mother had hidden her during the attack. They had fled into the woods and her mother had died protecting her. For a long moment they both stood silent. Only the sound of the river moving filled the air. Rowan's mind spun as he thought about what this meant. The lost daughter of the royal guardian living as a helper in his camp. He felt both awe and confusion. He wanted to protect her, but he also knew that this truth could bring danger to them all. He told her she must never let anyone else know. Not yet, because spies of the Black Wolf rebels still lived among the soldiers. And if they discovered her real identity, they would kill her without hesitation. Lena nodded, her voice shaking as she promised to stay silent. But she asked why he was helping her now when everyone else only laughed at her before. Rowan said quietly that bravery changes how a man sees another soul, that he saw her courage in the fire, and that he believed fate had brought her here for a reason. She looked at him with tears in her eyes and thanked him, for the first time feeling like she was not alone. As the day passed, strange things began to happen in the camp. A messenger arrived with an old scroll marked with the same dragon symbol. Rowan read it carefully and his expression darkened. The message said that the rebels were gathering again, that they were searching for something or someone connected to the royal mark. Lena's heart pounded as she realized they must have learned she was alive. The fear she had buried for years came roaring back, and she felt like the world was closing in around her. That night she could not rest. She sat outside under the stars, hugging her knees as the cold wind touched her face. She remembered her father's last words, his voice echoing from her childhood, telling her that the dragon flame would rise again when the time was right. She had never understood what it meant, but now she felt that the time was close, too close. She whispered into the night that she would not run anymore, that if her destiny was to fight, she would fight. not as a princess but as a soldier from the shadows. Rowan watched her quietly, the firelight painting her face in gold, and for the first time he felt hope. The kind of hope he thought had died long ago. Yet behind that hope was a whisper of fear, because he knew that when secrets like hers began to rise, darkness always followed, and soon the camp would no longer be safe for any of them. The morning began with a strange silence that felt heavy in the air. The soldiers moved slowly, whispering as if they knew something big was about to happen. The sun rose behind thick clouds that painted the sky in pale gold. Commander Rowan stood in the middle of the camp with his hands behind his back, his eyes dark with thought. He had not slept all night because his mind kept repeating one question again and again. Could the quiet girl with the tired eyes truly be the last child of the Royal Guard? And if she was, what was her purpose here now? He decided there was only one way to know. He needed to see what she could do. Not in words, not in stories, but in action. So he called for the soldiers to gather on the training field. His voice carried across the camp like thunder. The men ran to line up, laughing and joking. But when he announced that Lena would join the training, that laughter stopped at once. They looked at each other in disbelief, some even smirked, thinking the commander was testing them. How could the girl who once carried their water now stand among them as one of them? Lena froze when she heard her name. Her heart began to race, her hands shaking as every eye turned to her. She tried to speak, but her voice vanished. Rowan looked at her and said calmly that this was not a request. It was an order. She nodded slowly and stepped forward, her old boots sinking slightly into the soft dirt. Her stomach twisted with fear, but also something else, something like determination that she had not felt in years. The commander handed her a wooden sword, its weight heavy and strange in her small hands. The same soldiers who mocked her before began to whisper, waiting to see her fail. The commander shouted for the mock battle to begin. The soldiers charged at each other, shouting and clashing, dirt flying into the air. Lena stood still for a moment, unsure of what to do. Then one soldier ran toward her, laughing and swinging his sword lightly as if it was a game. She raised her arms to block him, and something deep inside her woke up. Her movements changed. Her feet shifted with balance she did not know she had. She dodged his strike, spun around, and tapped his shoulder with a swift counter hit that made him stumble backward. The crowd gasped, even Rowan's eyes widened. Another soldier came at her, stronger and faster. But she bent low, slipped past his attack, and swept his leg out from under him. She moved like someone who had trained her whole life, though she had never been trained in this camp. Every step she took seemed to echo the memory of a past she had buried, and for a brief second her mother's voice echoed in her mind, saying that the blood of warriors never forgets. The laughter in the camp turned to silence as they watched her fight again and again, her breath quick but steady, her body moving with strange grace. When the mock battle ended, the field was quiet. The men who once mocked her now stood speechless, sweat on their brows and disbelief in their eyes. Rowan walked toward her slowly, his boots crunching the dirt, his expression unreadable. He looked at her for a long time before speaking, his voice low and steady as he said that she fought like her father. Lena's eyes widened, her chest tightened. She whispered, asking what he meant, but Rowan only said that the way she moved, the way she reacted, the calm in her eyes, even in danger, all of it reminded him of General Kahl, the man she had called father. The wind blew softly across the field, carrying the scent of dust and smoke. Lena felt tears burning behind her eyes. She wanted to tell him that she had tried to forget that part of herself, that she had tried to be invisible, but now everything was changing too fast. She asked him if the soldiers would ever see her differently, and Rowan looked toward the men who were still staring and said that people respect strength and truth, and she had shown both today. But he warned her again that her secret must stay safe, that there were still spies who would kill for what she carried on her back. As the sun began to set, the soldiers returned to their tents quietly. No one laughed anymore. They all looked at Lena differently now, some with respect, some with fear, and some with confusion. She walked to the edge of the camp and sat alone by the fire, her hands still trembling from the battle. She stared at the wooden sword beside her and thought of her father's sword, the one she had last seen burning in the flames of her childhood home. She whispered that she would make him proud no matter what came next in his tent. Commander Rowan unrolled the message he had received from the capital earlier that day, his eyes narrowing as he read the words that warned of movement among the Black Wolf rebels. Reports said they were searching for something connected to the royal crest. His heart tightened as he realized they must have heard rumors about the girl. He clenched his fists and swore that he would protect her even if it meant going against his orders, because he had seen something in her that the world needed again. Courage mixed with kindness, strength without arrogance. That night the camp was quieter than ever before, but the silence was not peaceful. It was the silence that comes before a storm. Lena could feel it in the air, the strange tension that made her skin crawl. She did not know that beyond the dark hills men were already marching toward them, carrying the banner of the Black Wolf, and that soon the secret she and Rowan shared would no longer belong to them alone, but would become the spark that would change everything. The night air was thick with unease, the kind that made even the bravest soldier keep his sword close. The fires in the camp burned lower than usual and shadows danced on every wall. Lena sat by the edge of her tent, her fingers tracing the wooden sword beside her as she stared at the dark sky. The wind whispered across the plain, carrying a sound that almost felt like footsteps. But she told herself it was only her imagination. She was trying to stay calm, but her heart refused to rest because deep inside she could feel something coming. In his tent, Commander Rowan studied the map spread across the table, his jaw tense, his eyes following the red marks showing rebel movement along the northern border. He had sent a small patrol to confirm the reports, but they had not returned. Every moment of silence from them made him more certain that trouble was close. He looked toward Lena's tent through the opening flap, wondering how long he could keep her secret safe. Because if the Black Wolf rebels learned who she truly was, they would stop at nothing to capture her. Not for power, but for revenge as the sky turned darker. A sound rolled across the valley, a low distant rumble like thunder but heavier. The guards at the gate shouted warnings. Torches flared and the camp came alive with noise. Rowan rushed outside shouting orders. The soldiers scrambled to their stations. Spears clattered, boots pounded the ground, and through the smoke of their fires they saw them. The enemy riding out of the hills under a black flag with the mark of a wolf's head. Hundreds of them. Their eyes glowing like fire in the dark. Lena heard the alarm and jumped to her feet, her heart racing as she grabbed the sword. Outside, chaos was spreading, men running in every direction, horses neighing, the air filled with fear. She looked toward the command post and saw Rowan standing tall with his sword drawn, shouting for his men to form a line. She ran to join the medics, but the moment she saw the first wave of rebels charging through the fog, she knew this was no ordinary attack. They were coming for something specific, and when one of them shouted, "Find the girl with the mark," she felt the world freeze. She ducked behind a wagon as arrows flew past her, one cutting the edge of her sleeve. She pressed her hand against her chest, trying to stay silent, her mind flashing back to her mother's words about the mark. She realized the rebels had always been searching for her, that this was the moment she had feared all her life. She wanted to hide, but when she saw two soldiers fall nearby calling for help, she could not stay still. She ran to them, dragging one away from the fire, her breath sharp and her hands shaking. Commander Rowan fought fiercely near the front line, his voice echoing over the battle as he gave orders. He saw Lena through the smoke running toward the wounded, and his heart filled with both pride and fear. He shouted for her to stay back, but she did not hear him. The clash of metal drowned his voice. A rebel soldier broke through the line and charged at her from behind. Rowan ran toward her, but he was too far. She turned just in time, lifted the sword, and blocked the attack with surprising strength. The clash sent sparks flying, and the rebel stumbled back, shocked by her power. The fight dragged on for what felt like hours, though it was only minutes. The rebels kept coming, and the soldiers fought with everything they had. Rowan was wounded in the arm, but he did not stop. He cut through their front line, shouting for his men to push forward. Yet more rebels poured in from the ridge, surrounding them. Lena saw him fall to one knee, and something inside her broke. She ran through the chaos, ignoring the fire and the arrows, her feet bleeding as she reached him and caught him before he hit the ground, his blood staining her hands. He tried to speak, but his voice was weak. He told her to run, to save herself. But she shook her head and refused, her heart burning with fear and anger. She tore off her jacket to bandage his wound, and as she did, the soldiers and rebels around them froze, because for the first time the firelight fully touched her back, revealing the mark in its full shape. The dragon crest glowing faintly like living flame, a symbol no one had seen for years. A sound of shock rippled across the battlefield. Some soldiers dropped to their knees while the rebels pointed and shouted, "She is the heir," one rebel screamed. "The daughter of Kale, take her alive." But Lena was no longer afraid. She stood slowly with the sword in her hand, her face lit by fire, her eyes filled with tears and fury. She shouted for the soldiers to stand with her, her voice cutting through the smoke, saying that she was not their servant, not their burden, but their ally, their leader if they would have her. For a moment, no one moved. Then one soldier lifted his weapon and shouted her name. Another followed, and suddenly the line reformed around her. The rebels charged again, but this time the army did not retreat. Rowan lifted his head and saw Lena standing at the front like her father once did. His heart filled with pride even as his vision blurred. The soldiers fought harder than ever, their shouts shaking the ground. The rebels began to fall back, confused and afraid. Lena fought like the spirit of the dragon itself had awakened inside her. Every strike clean and fierce. Every movement burning with purpose. She no longer hid her mark. She wore it proudly like armor. When the last of the rebels retreated into the hills, the camp lay in ruin but alive. The soldiers cheered weakly. Rowan smiled faintly as Lena knelt beside him, her hands trembling. He whispered that the dragon had finally returned, and she looked up at the dawn light breaking through the smoke and whispered that the fight was not over yet. It was only beginning. The sky was red with the first light of dawn. Smoke drifted above the camp like dark clouds from another world. The wind carried the smell of fire and blood. The soldiers moved slowly among the ruins, gathering their wounded and counting their dead. The battle had ended, but its echo still lived in the ground. And in the middle of that silence stood Lena, her clothes torn, her hands bruised, her eyes filled with something stronger than fear. The mark on her back still glowing faintly in the pale morning light like a promise that could not be broken. Commander Rowan sat near the fire, his arm wrapped in cloth, his face pale but calm. He watched Lena from a distance as she helped the soldiers, her voice steady though her body trembled with exhaustion. He remembered the girl who used to walk with her head down and her eyes lowered, the one they all mocked and ignored, and he could hardly believe she was the same person standing now among warriors who looked at her with respect and awe. The same men who once laughed at her name now followed her words without question. Lena felt the weight of every life around her. She could hear the cries of the wounded and smell the smoke of what had been their home. She wanted to rest, but something inside her told her that the battle was not truly over. She looked to the east where the hills stretched far beyond sight, and she knew the rebels would return, stronger and angrier than before. Because they had seen what she was, and they would not stop until she was gone. She clenched her fists and whispered that she would not hide anymore. Not now, not ever again. The soldiers gathered around her as the sun rose higher, their faces tired and smeared with dirt. But in their eyes shone a new kind of fire, a belief that had been missing for too long. They had seen her fight and they had seen her stand without fear. They began to whisper her name not with mockery but with pride. Some even called her commander. And though she tried to tell them she was not worthy of such a title, they only smiled and said that no one else had earned it more than she had. Rowan called her to his side, his voice weak but firm. He told her that the kingdom would soon hear about what happened, that her secret could no longer stay hidden, and that the royal blood in her veins would draw both allies and enemies. He said the world would try to use her name, but she must never let anyone use her heart. She nodded quietly and told him that she did not want to be a princess or a symbol. She only wanted to protect the people who had stood beside her. He smiled faintly and said that those were the words of a true leader that evening. When the fires were lit again and the camp began to rebuild, Lena walked through the rows of soldiers speaking to each one, thanking them for their courage, helping them tie their bandages, sharing food even though she had none left for herself. She did not stand above them but among them, and the men who had once seen her as a shadow now saw her as their light. One young soldier whispered to another that the spirit of the dragon had returned through her, and soon that whisper spread across the camp like a soft prayer. Far beyond the camp, in the dark mountains, the leader of the Black Wolf rebels sat in his tent, his eyes burning with rage as he listened to the report from his scouts. They told him the girl was alive and that she bore the dragon mark. He crushed his cup in his hand and swore that he would find her and finish what the rebellion had started years ago. He said that the blood of General Kyle would not rise again, and his men bowed before him as he ordered them to gather every soldier they could find. The next battle would decide the future of the land back at the camp. Lena stood at the edge of the field looking at the sky turning gold. She could still hear the cries of the past in her memory, her mother's voice, her father's laughter, the sound of fire swallowing their home. But now those memories did not break her. They gave her strength. She felt that their spirits were with her, guiding her. She placed her hand over the mark on her back and whispered a promise that she would carry their name with honor and never let it fade again. Commander Rowan walked up beside her, his steps slow but steady. He told her that a messenger from the capital would arrive soon, and that when he did, she would have to decide who she wanted to be. Lena looked at him with calm eyes and said that she had already decided. She would no longer hide behind fear or pain. She would fight for those who had no one to fight for them. She said she would rebuild the royal guard not as nobles but as protectors of the people, Rowan nodded and said that her father would have been proud. As the night fell again, the soldiers gathered around a new fire, their voices rising together in a quiet chant. They spoke of victory and of hope, and in the middle of them Lena stood tall with her sword resting beside her, the firelight reflected in her eyes like golden flame, her hair blowing in the wind. She was no longer the girl they mocked or pitied. She had become something greater, the spirit of courage reborn. The commander of the dragon's faraway thunder rolled across the sky, hinting that another storm was coming. But Lena did not flinch. She lifted her face toward the wind and whispered that whatever came she would face it, not as a lost child but as the warrior her parents raised her to be. The soldiers bowed their heads and followed her lead, and in that moment under the burning sky the legend of the dragon's heir began again.